Happy Cinco de Mayo, folks. I got my Corona with lime. One sip, everybody knows the rules. 10 out of 10. So, I just made a video talking about the easy problem of consciousness. And now, I want to talk about the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem is actually easier to explain than the easy problem. So, real quick refresher. The easy problem of consciousness is that we can, from a kind of a scientific perspective, from a neuroscientific perspective, we know that certain experiences map onto certain states of the brain. So we have this correlation of a specific experience a human has, and then we can kind of scan the brain and see what exactly is going on in the brain that is correlated with that experience. But here's where the hard problem comes in. That correlation doesn't explain why the experience and why consciousness is there in the first place. So the hard problem of consciousness is, why is consciousness there in the first place? Why or how does it arise? Because we simply just don't know this. We know we have experience, we know we are conscious, but from a scientific perspective, we don't know why it's there, we don't know why it feels the way it feels, and why it feels like anything, essentially. And many people, kind of like I mentioned in the last video, might feel like, why, like, this is kind of dumb, like, of course we're conscious, like, it just arises with biology. But we scientists simply don't know why consciousness arises or how it arises. There's many theories out there. Probably the most popular theory is that it tends to arise with enough information processing. So you get enough information processing going on, and boom, consciousness arises, typically with brains and nervous systems. So some people think it probably only arises in humans and other animals that possess similar brains and nervous systems. And there's even theories that go all the way down, called panpsychism, that think consciousness comes with all matter in the universe. So all matter, all bits of matter in the universe possess some sort of consciousness. So some would say an atom is conscious. And like I mentioned in the previous video, this problem is so hard because, just take the example of panpsychism real quick. If all matter in the universe is conscious all the way down to atoms, if that were true, it wouldn't really change anything about the physical world. So the physical world is doing its thing, the physics of the world are doing its thing, and it just so happens that certain creatures like ourselves possess consciousness, and we simply don't know why or how that is there in the first place. So if it were true that matter all the way down to atoms were conscious, that wouldn't change the physics of anything. So it's kind of hard to fully dispute that. And again, that's why this hard problem is so hard, because it's really hard to ask the right questions and to study the right questions. And like I said, it's so hard because we don't know the physics of consciousness at all. I know Roger Penrose said you can't compute consciousness. So basically you could take the most insane quantum computer, you could even probably, like in the TV show Devs, be able to predict outcomes in the future based on quantum computation, but all that still doesn't give you consciousness at all. So it is something really hard to study, and why I think you might not ever really be able to find an answer, because it's hard to figure out what the world would be like if we knew how consciousness arises and what caused it to arise. Because from the level of physics, it doesn't change anything. So that is the hard problem, and that's about as summed up as it gets. I remember I was listening to a Sam Harris podcast, and I think it was him. I don't know if he stole this from somebody else or was talking about somebody else's example, but it's important to point out that consciousness doesn't do anything. It simply arises and is kind of along for the ride. And a good example in this podcast that Sam Harris used was, you have a train on the railroad tracks, and that train is essentially your physical body. And then you have the smoke coming out the front of the train, and it just kind of like hovering. That smoke just kind of dissipates and is kind of hovering over the train track. And that's essentially what consciousness is. It's just kind of along for the ride of, as far as our situation is concerned, human life. It's just kind of along for the ride, much like that smoke steaming out of the train is along for the ride of that train. So that's kind of like a really good example to explain kind of just how consciousness, all it is experience, and how it's just along for the ride and it isn't actually doing anything. So that is the hard problem, and I simply don't know what, like, if the science came out and we knew, if we kind of figured the hard problem out and we knew what causes consciousness to arise, it's just like, it's so hard to really study this, because you have the brain, and as complex as the brain is in and of itself, and we're working so hard just to fully understand the neuroscience and neurophysiology of the brain, much less trying to figure out how all of that complexity gives rise to something as kind of mysterious as experience and consciousness. But it's really hard to ask the right questions to guide us to the correct answer of how it arises in the first place. My theory, it's not even a theory, but in my opinion, is that it arrives from some sort of, I kind of go along with the information processing theory, that if you get enough information processing, such as the complexity and the amount of information processing in the brain, you get consciousness arises with that. And I remember hearing Elon Musk in a podcast said something very similar, Elon Musk, that it's just kind of comes, I believe he said something along the lines that it kind of arises with enough computing of the brain. So this also begs to guide us in the direction of, there's nothing special about humans being the kind of the pieces of meat that we are that gives rise to this. If it were true that consciousness arises due to enough information processing, then you could build computers with enough complexity and enough complexity as the human brain, and then computers would be conscious. And then that goes to the whole kind of Westworld scenario, where these robots that act exactly like humans, and all it is like they're programmed in such a way and they're fed stories in such a way that they tend to act just like humans, and when it comes down to it, they're just a computer program. And it certainly seems like in that show that the robots are conscious. They're sort of aware of themselves. It is something like to be Dolores. If you haven't seen the show, go watch it. It's absolutely fantastic. So you would, from the outside looking in, you would suppose that they are conscious, and there's enough, due to that complex computer program, there's enough information processing in there that, boom, it gives rise to being conscious. I don't know. I don't study this. I don't even think I'd want to study it, because I'd probably my mind would go crazy. But I think it's an interesting topic, which is why I'm talking about it. And I think it's important to kind of distinguish between the easy problem and the hard problem. The easy problem being, we know certain states of the brain are correlated to specific experiences, but that doesn't tell us why the experience is there in the first place. And that is the hard problem. Why does it arise? How does it arise? And kind of why does it feel like anything to be me? So there we go. Have a good Cinco de Mayo. I'm going to go enjoy probably some more of these. go hang out with some friends, enjoy some Mexican food, and have a daily good old time. Have a good one, folks.